Hey, Crawlspace listeners, we wanted to bring you this additional Dean murder coverage. We're diving back into this one. This episode originally aired back in 2017, but again, we're getting back into it. We're going to visit the Dean farm soon, and we're speaking with author Ken Sheldon in an upcoming episode about his new book called Deep Water.
So what you're about to hear is our interview that we conducted with an author, Jack Coey. He wrote a few books about the Dean murder, fictionalized accounts, and the book that Ken wrote is, I believe, the first nonfiction true crime account of the Dean murder. So we wanted to have you listen to both and compare and contrast them to get two different authors' perspective on this over 100-year-old mystery.
Welcome to Crawlspace.
All right, Lance, here we are in the Crawlspace studios talking about the murder of Dr. Dean. And last Saturday, we went to go see this writer, Jack Coey.
Yeah, no other place I'd rather be right now than Wormtown, Massachusetts, nestled in this building, talking about a murder that happened in 1918. Jack Coey is a local expert. He resides in the Monadnock region and has lived there for, I would say, the majority of his life. He's a writer. Short stories, I'd say novellas, but he has had the Dean murder on his mind for the better part of 25, 27 years.
He's got a fever, Lance, and the only cure is writing more Dean books. So he's written 4 books now on this story that we're talking about here, the murder of Dr. Dean from 1918.
Right. His first book was Two-Legged Foxes.
Which I loved.
Which is a really good read. All of his books are really good reads.
Yeah.
And then he had August 13th, and then he wrote
Lights from Monadnock. He's currently working on a new one. I believe that the working title is The Murder of Dr. Dean. Yeah, I think the death maybe of Dr. Dean.
The death of Dr. Dean. It's in the works. He goes on in this interview later on to say that it's hopefully the definitive version that he's written, but something tells me if he has some more ideas or something else percolates after this one is published, the next definitive edition will be released.
Yeah, well, he did say, and he's a writer, and so he gets the process, but he did say that every time he wrote a book about this, he was hoping that was the definitive version. So this next version, this new book that he's writing, I think it's called The Death of Dr. Dean, is due out in January, so we'll let you know when that's available. But all of his books are available on Amazon, and they're pretty reasonably priced. And I'm reading Lights from Monadnock now, and I think it's very good. So yeah, and Lance, so you have a history with this guy, and we're going to play some clips from our meeting. Actually, it was like a 2-hour and 20-minute interview with Jack up in Keene. So we're going to play some clips from that, and you have a history with this guy that you're going to talk about in this first clip.
We don't specifically say how we met. How we met was I'd written some really horrible articles for the high school newspaper. I planned on a whole series about the Dean murder, but that didn't quite work out. I believe graduation was coming. I probably a lot of my projects senior year of high school didn't really work out.
A little too ambitious for your own good.
A little too lazy.
Okay.
A little too lazy.
Yeah.
So I can't remember how he ended up reading these articles, but he visited me at my workplace. I want to say I was like a dishwasher, and I think he visited me there and said that he read the articles, and if I wanted to swing by his studio, he was writing a book on it, and he was writing Two-Legged Foxes at the time, and his studio was like a loft attic in a place called the Woodbound Inn. So Woodbound Inn is it's the restaurant, a little staple of the.
I feel like I can picture it just from the name.
Yeah, it's exactly.
And I did see the picture in his house of him in his attic studio there doing his writing.
We ended up talking for the morning. He was telling me about his writing process, and he was talking about the Dean murder. And what we end up discussing here at the beginning of this interview is it was a really short film myself and some high school colleagues put together, kind of describing the circumstances surrounding Dr. Dean's death. And we shot it on, I believe it was like 8mm or 16mm. It was one of my friend's family's old camera, so it had this old grainy look. It was black and white, silent. We put music to it, and on I can't remember which anniversary, but it was an anniversary of the murder, and we showed it at the Civic Center in Jaffrey, and there was all the evidence was laid out in the case.
That's powerful.
The socks, the rope,
my
the
God.
bag.
If we could see this now, how great would this be?
I have no idea where it is right now. So if anyone who was a part of that, and you know who you are, if you're listening, if you were a part of that, part of me wants to say just burn it.
No, don't burn it. No. Email us at crawlspacepodcast@gmail.com. And
only if your subject line is "I burned that film."
Okay, so here's the first clip with Jack Cooey.
You and I go back a little bit. You were first introduced to, or I was first introduced to you in 1995. 1996.
Right.
Yep. And what was the circumstances around that?
Well, as I remember, you were working on a project.
Mm-hmm.
I think you wanted to do a film.
Probably.
Because I remember you told a funny story about, we were talking about Mrs. Dean being a possible suspect here.
Yep.
And you did a rehearsal of the film you wanted to do, and you had one of your people pick up somebody and have them carry him up the hill.
Yeah.
And it was a funny story because you said, with the amount of difficulty you had doing it, there's no way you believe that Mrs. Dean did it.
Right.
But it was a funny story the way you told it.
We actually had, I can't remember if it was a 16mm camera that we were using, and it was for the Jaffrey Historical Society, and it was a recreation of all of the more important parts that we gathered from the transcript, and one of them was to recreate the actual carrying or dragging from the stone wall to the cistern. And we had the conversation about whether or not Mrs. Dean could have done it, and it was hard enough to have young men do it. And the actor we were carrying, I remember, he might have weighed 100 pounds. I mean, he was small. So that pretty much dispelled that that theory in my head. How did you get started in this? When did it first come to your attention?
It probably goes back to 1993, and I had a day off coming up, and I mentioned to another employee that I was going to hike Mount Monadnock, and he said, "Oh, well, you ought to go up and see the cave where they found the German spies and captured them, and brought them down to Jaffrey and stuffed them down a well," or some convoluted story about a cave and spies and so on and so forth. And I think part of being a writer is that it's almost like a musician hearing a sound or a note. You hear the potential story, and when it piques your curiosity, you follow that lead. I mean, you investigate further, and you find out more and more about it, and to develop a story. And I found out very quickly about the grand jury testimony that was available at the library, so I went to the library and got the grand jury testimony, read that, and of course knew that Margaret Bean was still in town, and I sent her a letter, and she wrote back very kindly and invited me to come see her, and I spent interviewed her several times, quite extensively. I mean, we started at 1 in the afternoon and finished at 5:30, and she was a wonderful woman. I mean, she was a very kind, very sweet woman, and this caused problems for me later on, but what she was able to do is she was able to give me the real human side of this thing. I mean, it's one thing to look at documentation, it's another thing to hear the human side of the story, and that's really what she gave me. And I say it developed into a problem because later on, I became very conflicted about when I started doing my research, and I started to realize that my research was taking me in a direction that was not in agreement with what her understanding of the crime was. So that set up a conflict to me, because I was, on a personal level, I really admired Margaret Bean, and I didn't want to do anything to upset her or anger her. But on the other hand, the factual documentation or the research I was doing led me in a different direction. So I was conflicted for a long time about that.
Okay, so that was the first clip with Jack Cooey, and some really interesting things there. One thing that I wanted to mention, that he mentions Margaret Bean, who is Mark Bean's mom. Mark Bean is, of course, of the Dean Murder Research Group. He's been on the podcast on this coverage. He's prevalent in, I think, episodes 3 and 4. And so his mom actually transcribed the grand jury hearing from Pittman shorthand, which we've talked about on this, which is basically scribbles, and it's not actually scribbles. It's a language that people can translate, and Margaret Bean, Mark's mom, did that, transcribed these. So that was who he was talking about. I think what he talks about is that his opinions started differing from Margaret Bean. And we kind of get into that later in the conversation, but I think that's pretty interesting.
Exactly. We do get into that a little later in the conversation when he starts comparing the grand jury transcript that she took from the Pittman shorthand with the Department of Justice accounts, witness statements and accounts. So we saw some contradictions there, which is interesting. And Mark Bean, the Bean family, we've mentioned on the show before that they're really deep in the Jaffrey history as well. They had Bean and Simons, which was a lumber company
back then. Back in 1918. So they had this big company in town,
right? And they were located right on the railroad tracks. So it was this commerce that was in this small town in the middle of New England, pretty much kind of smack dab in the middle of New England, small town.
Yep.
And Bean and Simons had the lumber company, and now if you go up there, you'll see D.D. Bean and Son. That's the matchmaking company, not the
Matchsticks.
Matchsticks,
yeah, not Match.com.
Not Match.com.
Right.
And Mark Bean is a member of the Dean Murder Research Group, a super generous guy. If you want to check out some of his papers, they're on the deanmurder.org. If you go to the section where it's Dean Murder Resources, the Dean Murder Project, he's got a paper on there.
Cool.
And it's Mark Bean's paper, just describing the lineage, I guess, and he breaks down some of the characters that are involved in the case.
Okay, great.
And by the way, that copy that he showed of Margaret Bean's
Yes.
transcript was the same one that I saw, like when I
Back
met
in
him
the 90s?
at the Woodbound Inn. Yeah.
Okay.
A couple more pieces of tape on this one, though, I think.
Okay, and there is video of this conversation with Jack Cooey on our YouTube page, youtube.com/crawlspace. So you can check it out there if you want to immerse yourself a little deeper with this situation. So this next clip right here is Jack. He starts talking about the cave that was found on Mount Monadnock that is pretty interesting.
I wanted to go back to 3 things that you mentioned. One was the caves. So you mentioned to one of your coworkers, you said that you wanted to go. You were gonna
climb the mountain, and I got this kind of convoluted story about the cave and the spies on the mountain and so forth.
So that's you.
That's me by the cave. Yeah.
By the cave. Is this the first time that you discovered the cave in that picture? Or
I was with Larry Davis. You may know Larry Davis. He climbs Mount Monadnock every day.
Oh, that's the guy who climbs Mount Monadnock every day.
Right.
Does he
Larry
still
Davis.
do that?
Yeah, you told me about that guy.
I believe I run that's another whole fascinating story, because every time I go on the mountain, it doesn't matter what time of day it is or what day, I just go on the mountain and I run into Larry Davis. It's uncanny. Yeah, he took me up there, and he's the one that took this photograph. He's also a photographer, so he took this photograph. And we did an article at the Peterborough Transcript, and we use this as the photograph.
And the other thing I wanted to come back on is you spoke to Margaret Bean, and you mentioned the grand jury testimony, the grand jury hearing, and that's the one down there that she she transcribed from the Pittman shorthand.
Right. Now this is pretty beat up because it's been this is from 1993, but and of course I got all my notes and everything.
And you also said that you're a writer. You were a writer before you started it on the Dean.
Yeah, and I write short stories and to circle back to your question, the Dean murder. I keep writing it. I have another version coming out in January called "The Death of Dr. Dean," but I keep writing it because dramatically, I'll do a version and then I'll sit on it for 6 months, a year, and I go back, I look at it and say, I could do better with this. There's more dramatic potential here that I could get, and so I rewrite it again, and I try to. It's like distilling whiskey almost. I mean, you have to kind of filter it and filter it and filter it and filter it. And I don't know how many times you have to do it. I may not be done yet. I hope I am, but I may not be. But you have to keep working it to get the potential out of the story.
Was there something in the grand jury testimony or something in the FBI files that you looked at and said, there's a story here?
I don't think I'm not sure what I was trying to do with Two-Legged Fox. Really, it's very short. It's only 48 pages. I think my initial strategy with the Dean murder story was that I thought that I didn't have to change anything, that the story is so good, just the unvarnished facts of the story are so dramatic and so good that I really didn't need to customize it in any sort of way. So I think it's probably just a kind of a general overview of the crime. Really, I don't know that I really at that point. I don't know that I had as focused an interpretation as I developed later on.
Okay.
So I think it's more of a general kind of a.
Okay. And where does the title Two-Legged Foxes come from?
That comes from when Mrs. Morrison visited Dean Farm on the 13th of August. She and Dr. Dean were walking up the farm road between the bungalow and the big house, and she knew that he had this flock of turkeys. So she suggested to him that he might be willing to donate a turkey to this raffle that they wanted to have for the rummage sale they wanted to have to make money for the Peterborough Hospital. And he said, well, I'd love to donate a turkey, but I'm afraid I don't have that many or something like that. She said, really? Well, why is that? And he said, well, I've got a fox. And she said, oh, you mean I think she said, oh, your fox is taking your turkeys? He said, well, yeah, but I think this is a two-legged fox.
Right.
And the idea that Dean is trying to kind of obliquely communicate there is that there's somebody in the woods, I guess, that's coming onto his place at night and taking his turkeys and then I guess going out and cooking the turkeys somehow and eating the turkeys. But anyway, there's somebody in the woods.
Okay, so that was the second clip.
The cave that he's speaking about on Mount Monadnock has been there since 1902. It's Pompelli Cave. I think it was originally called like Megalithia Cave. And the story behind it is that it was right around 1902, two kids they decided to build a place to hang out on Mount Monadnock. And they hauled these metal sheets up there. They actually did the bag of concrete. They mixed the concrete and put it around the walls so that they'd have this place to chill out when they were on Mount Monadnock. So that's been there since 1902. The exact location of it, I think they try to keep that kind of under wraps, but it's sort of pseudo famous in mountain climbing in the mountain climbing network.
Right.
You know, if you get to Pompelli Cave, you know, you take a picture of it, but you just don't really reveal so much of the exact location of it.
Have you been to it?
I've climbed Mount Monadnock several times and I've never been there.
Interesting. So you don't know where it is?
It's definitely not on the trails that I typically climb.
Right.
I think it's on one of the more roundabout trails.
Okay, yeah. Everyone's hiking Mount Monadnock. Maybe that's something we'll have to do since I love hiking now.
Yeah, since you're a seasoned hiker now, you're gonna do Monadnock, and you're gonna be like, really?
This is a mountain?
This is a fun hill. Yeah. Now, number 1 climbed mountain in the world.
Wow. Okay. Well, maybe we'll find that cave sometime this spring or summer. And here is the next clip.
After you've written 3 books and you're writing a new book on it, what's your feeling on Georgina Hodgkin's book, Prime Suspect?
I thought it was self-serving.
Uh-huh.
I think that she wanted to protect her brother-in-law. I mean, I think she wanted to protect Rich, and I think that was her point of view, and that was her purpose in writing the book.
Okay. And are your books categorized as fiction or nonfiction?
They're fiction.
They're fiction.
Yes.
And why would they be categorized as fiction?
Well, again, getting back to this idea of the dramatic potential of the story, I didn't want to limit myself necessarily to the historical facts, because what you have to do is that if there's a secret meeting, for example, you have to extrapolate that into what did that mean, right? So that's where you have to have the fictional license, if you will, to do that. You can't say, as a historian, you've got to stick to the facts, right? Mm-hmm. But as a fiction writer, you can take a fact and then amplify the fact, which is what you want to do to get the greatest dramatic impact out of it.
Okay.
Right?
You just mentioned a secret meeting.
Yes.
What's the root of that?
In January of 1919, a man by the name of John Bartlett, who was a Republican, took the office of governor in the state of New Hampshire. He was a Mason. He appointed a man by the name of Oscar Young as Attorney General. Oscar Young was a Mason. In January of 1999, we got a Masonic governor and a Masonic Attorney General. In December 13th of 1918, Charles Rich and his lawyer, Mr. Ruby, went to the Department of Justice and gave an extensive interview. And the agents that were present for that interview were Norman Gifford, who was the assistant superintendent of the Boston office, Robert Valkenburg, and Ferry Weiss, all experienced agents. But he gave an extensive interview to the Department of Justice for those three agents. After that interview, he asked for a letter of exoneration from the Department of Justice, which they refused to give him. So there are a couple things going on here. First, the Department of Justice may have felt played by Rich because he's asking for this letter of exoneration after that interview.
Rich is asking for the letter of exoneration.
Rich is asking for the letter, okay? The other thing is that Roy Picard, the county attorney, for months now is saying Mrs. Dean did it, Mrs. Dean did it, Mrs. Dean did it, Mrs. Dean did it. He's also saying no to an autopsy. He's also saying no to a grand jury, okay?
Roy Picard was saying no to the grand jury.
Yes,
okay.
He was saying no to the grand jury. So I think that what happened was that they'd had this extensive interview with Rich. The investigation is going nowhere. I think it appears as though Picard is stonewalling the investigation by the refusal, his insistence on Mrs. Dean being the suspect and his refusal for a grand jury. So in March 21st of 1919, those three agents, and this is significant because Norman Gifford has got to come from Boston up here to have these interviews. Those three agents go to Bean and Simons and have an extensive interview with Bean and Simons. The same three agents, Gifford, Valkenburg, and Weiss.
And what's Bean and Simons?
Bean and Simons is a lumber yard. It's Dilsey Bean and Merrill Simons. It's a lumber yard. It started out in Ringe and they moved it to Jaffrey to be closer to the railroad.
Gotcha.
But like I said, these three agents showed up and interviewed Bean and Simons. Now the other aspect to this is that there was a petition at that time being passed around Jaffrey for the citizens to sign to present to the county officials, Roy Picard, to have a grand jury hearing, okay? And Bean and Simons did not sign the petition. So a lot of this interview was talking about why they didn't sign the petition and how come they didn't feel a grand jury was a good idea. I think there's something happened in that interview process that upset.
Like an intimidation thing?
Well, intimidation maybe, or accusation, or intimidation, whatever it is. I think they roughed up Bean and Simons enough, so they made them angry. There's a story about Dilsey Bean that Margaret told me about. He was in a lumbering, out in the woods lumbering one time, and a child was born. And the Catholic Church at that time wanted children to be baptized within the first 2 weeks of their birth. And because Bean was out in the woods, he couldn't get to the church in those 2 week period to have this baptism for the child. And when he did get to the church, the priest criticized him for not getting there sooner, and Bean just left the church. So
permanently left the church?
Yeah, he just left the church. He originally was Catholic, and I'm not sure what his denomination was after that, but he left the church over this criticism of the priest. So I think that Bean was the kind of guy that you didn't mess with him. I mean, I think if you did, you just didn't mess with him. And so I think if these federal guys went in and kind of played hardball with him a little bit, he probably pushed back.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Okay, so a little bit more on the Bean family there. I find the story about Delsey Bean, who is Mark's grandfather now, right?
That would be Mark's grandfather, I believe. Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
so leaving the Catholic Church.
Basically telling the Catholic Church, like, F you. I'm sorry I was
Yeah.
out in the woods for over 2 weeks cutting down trees to make, the company better. Sorry I couldn't make it back for your precious baptism.
Right.
So, yeah, left the church. Just kind of shows where his priorities are.
Right. Family.
Right.
Family and not necessarily...
Family, community.
Yes, like, wanting to deal with the church or people telling you what to do and that kind of thing.
We also get into the Masons there, right?
Yes.
Which is one of I don't know if he's backed off a little bit from it, but Jack's big on the Mason angle when it comes to the case. He talks about the secret meeting. He talks about the fact that the county solicitor, who is sort of the Roy Picard, who is the county solicitor, which is basically like a legal practitioner that operates in jurisdictions of communities.
He didn't want the grand jury to happen.
He didn't want the grand jury to happen. He was a Mason. Oscar Young, the attorney general, who led the grand jury hearing, was also...
Yeah, who we heard from in episode 1. We have an actor read Oscar Young's opening statement from the grand jury hearing.
Now, I believe our actor is also a Mason, which is all part of the whole conspiracy.
I don't think so.
No, is he?
I have no idea, honestly.
No.
I don't know. Maybe. Probably not. But I do have another friend who's a Mason, but we can get into that later. We do get more into the Masons, which is interesting. And you hear it, and it's like, oh, it's a secret society. It sounds so fucking secretive, and what are they up to? And more than likely, not a lot of real, like, crazy stuff, but there have been stories, of course, this one being one.
I think Jack does a really good job of, and we'll hear it, the whole Mason thing is sprinkled throughout everything that Jack does. And he doesn't necessarily promote that image of the Masons as a group being an extremely evil group. He promotes the theory that they were a fraternal society that looked out for its members.
Okay. And let's hear what Jack has to say.
This is from March 22nd, 1919, Department of Justice. Continuing investigation last reported on the 21st, agent accompanied by Agent Weiss called on Mrs. Elizabeth Bryant, East Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Agents at this point received confidential information that a secret conference was to be held at Winchton, Mass. At some hotel by the following persons: County Solicitor Picard, Cheshire County, New Hampshire; Sheriff Lord, Keene, New Hampshire; Delsey Bean; Mr. White of East Jaffrey, New Hampshire; Merrill G. Simons; and Mr. Webster. Agents motored to Winchton, Mass. Without a moment's delay in an automobile loaned by the selectmen of East Jaffrey, New Hampshire. Agents, after taking the proprietor of the new Winchton Hotel into their confidence, secured a room adjoining one which the proprietor agreed to rent to the subjects if they should come to this hotel.
And this is from what are you reading from?
Department of Justice reports.
From March 1919.
Yep, March 22nd, 1919.
So that's describing a meeting in a Winchendon hotel.
Correct.
Okay. And what was the basis of this meeting?
This is the meeting that came as a result of them being interviewed by the federal guys.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Okay.
So this is the day after.
Okay.
All right? Now, the Mrs. Bryant, I'm not sure how Mrs. Bryant got this information. Because of such a big deal about this grand jury, both Simons and Bean had to answer for their lack of signatures on the petition, and the perception in town was that they were trying to protect somebody because they didn't sign the petition. All right.
Yep.
So they were vulnerable in a sense to that criticism.
Yep.
And I think that the purpose of the meeting was they told Picard, have the grand jury, but make sure nothing happens. Now they could say that because they know the Attorney General, who's going to run the grand jury, is a Mason, and they know the governor's a Mason. Interestingly, very shortly after this meeting, Picard all of a sudden changed his mind and he announced a grand jury at the Keene Courthouse on April 11th of 1919.
Like a month later.
Yeah, a month later. But he changed his attitude about the grand jury completely after this meeting.
Okay, so some interesting facts here about this interrogation at Bean and Simon's, and then this quote-unquote secret meeting that happens at the Winchendon Hotel, and then the grand jury is announced to be held a month later.
Yeah, maybe we're calling the secret meeting a little. Maybe that's being too nefarious.
Yeah, that's why I put it in air quotes.
Yeah, it was a meeting of high level. Prominent citizens in Jaffrey who met at the Winchendon Hotel the day after the Department of Justice had talked with them. Mm-hmm. And then that's when Roy Picard came forward and said, okay, we're going to have the grand jury testimonies. I guess on it, if it's all about how you present that, right? It seems really weird when you start saying these are Masons and it's a secret meeting, but look at the circumstances as well. These are prominent citizens in the town. They want to protect their community. I don't see anything that strange about a group of people looking to protect the community having a meeting after being interviewed by the Department of Justice about this murder and
right.
What's the best course of action.
Right. I don't see anything strange about that either, but what I do find strange is that Picard did not want to have the grand jury in the first place and then changed his mind because of this meeting where, and I'm kind of taking a little bit of liberties saying that, but it does sound like that's probably what happened.
It is strange, right? Why someone of a legal stature wouldn't want to have a grand jury based on this murder.
The brutality
Exactly.
of this murder happening in this tiny town.
Right. Maybe it was a case where he wanted to sweep it under the rug and hope that it went away. But that doesn't really kind of mesh with him being in that position in the first place. You don't get to that position sweeping things under the carpet. So I would say the meeting by itself isn't so strange, but the circumstances of him changing his mind after that meeting and why he was thinking that way in the first place are very peculiar.
Yeah. I could see him not wanting to have the grand jury because he felt there might not be enough evidence for, like, to charge someone or something like that. He's obviously got a legal mind like that. However, that's one of the reasons you have a grand jury is to see what you have for evidence.
In order to charge someone for the murder, and the results of the grand jury, now this could be me putting on my conspirator's hat, the results of the grand jury said that person or persons unknown. So those responsible for Dean's death at the end of the grand jury hearing was person or persons unknown. So they did not determine that there was enough information to put somebody to go forward with a trial. They said it was person or persons unknown. So maybe that meeting was saying, listen, let's move forward with the whole judicial process, and we'll make sure that there's no findings at the end.
Yeah. Okay, here's the next clip. I think we get more into the Masons.
How are the Masons connected to the actual murder?
This is a man by the name of Herbert Sawtell, who was a banker, who was a good friend of Charles Rich's. He worked in Boston, but he had a place up in the Jaffrey area on one of the lakes, and he used to come up every summer. This is Herbert Sawtell. The whole thing in Cheshire County is this. Rich is a political power there, and he domineers Picard and Young, and that is the reason the case has fallen flat. Now he talks about Russell Henchman. Russell Henchman has got to thank Rich for every job that he ever had, and I have it from good authorities that Rich made him postmaster in East Jaffrey. Now, Russell Henchman was the superintendent of waterworks. He was a postmaster. I think he was a selectman for a year. He got all those jobs through the help of Charles Rich. Susan Henchman is the assistant cashier of the Monadnock National Bank, and it is well known that Rich and she are very intimate. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. Get it? Okay? Rich is one bad fault. He is very sweet with the fair sex and will go out of his way when he sees a nice face. Okay? Now that little blurb there about Rich opens up a whole other vista to this thing, because the only other material about Rich you're going to find is official biography. I mean, he was a narrator. He was a moderator of the town meeting. He was blah 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 blah. This gives a flesh and blood glimpse into what Rich was like as a man. All right. And so that opens up, as I say, a whole new vista of this thing, because he has a relationship with Susan Henchman. He's got a relationship with her brother, that he's either currying favor with Susan by helping out his brother, who's a plumber by trade. And you've got episodes with henchmen where, for example, on Thursday following the murder, they find the body on Wednesday. On Thursday following the murder, henchman inexplicably goes up to Dean Farm and is cleaning up in the barn in the big house. Have you heard that story?
Henchman is the one who ends up pretty much clearing all of potential evidence and blood stains. He's the one that went up to the barn
Right.
and cleaned it all up.
Yeah, he goes up on Thursday to clean up in the barn in the big house. The front page article is, brutal murder in East Jaffrey. William K. Dean's body found in rainwater cistern, had been beaten about the head, bound and tied in weighted sack. No cause for murder known. Now, his legs were bound. This is a part of the article. His legs were bound at the knees. In the barn nearby, there were some blood stains, and there were others on the piazza of the big house.
Okay.
Okay, you got it?
Yep.
So somebody read the article and said,
I got to go clean this up.
yeah, right, exactly.
That was published from the
That's the Peterborough transcript, 1918,
on Thursday.
on Thursday.
And
that's when Henchman went up to the barn on Thursday. Now, the other funny story about that is that as I say, Henchman's original occupation was a plumber. And so the federal guy said, hey, what's the deal with cleaning up in the barn in the big house?
yeah.
And he said, well, I was turning off the water so the pipes wouldn't freeze. And the federal agent said, in August?
Yeah.
Right.
So he had no reason,
He had no reason
to be up
Yeah,
there.
Right. Given that Sawtell glimpse into Charles Rich being vulnerable to a pretty face,
Yep.
I think that's a reasonable expansion on the story that is legitimate to take.
It would give a more normal kind of motive, right? If it's like a love triangle,
Right.
not this
Seems-
huge
yeah.
German spy conspiracy.
Right.
Seems more relatable.
Very much
like on a
more
human
relatable,
level. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Very much more of a human mystery if you look at it that way.
Okay, so really interesting stuff there about Susan Henchman and her brother, who, what was his first name?
Russell?
Russell. He was up there cleaning the barn and the big house.
Yeah. So what Jack does, because he's writing these stories of fiction, is he does take the actual accounts from the Department of Justice and the transcripts. And I liked when he read that part about Sawtell saying that Russell Henchman, pretty much owes every job that he's received to Charles Rich. So he was, in a sense, indebted to Charles Rich. And it's also stated in what he read from the Department of Justice that the accounts of Rich being enamored by a pretty face and basically saying, without saying, that he was having an affair with Susan Henchman by saying, you know what I mean,
Right.
by saying that they had an intimate relationship or whatever, and you know what I mean,
Right.
there was a connection there. Now,
So the connection that Jack has made is that Rich and Susan Henchman are having an affair at the bank, or I don't know where, but they work at the bank together and they're having an affair, and her brother is ironically Charles Rich's henchman.
Right. He's living up to his namesake for Charles Rich. The creative license that Jack takes is that Dean was also enamored with Susan Henchman. So you're talking about like two late 50s, early 60-year-old men being enamored with a woman.
Reminds me of Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon.
It's exactly like Grumpy Old Men, but with a murderous ending.
Right.
A brutal ending.
That part is a little far-fetched for me, that they're both having an affair with this one woman. I don't, and obviously he doesn't know, we don't know what's true, who knows, but what is true is this henchman type of role that Russell Henchman has towards Rich. He's sort of his go-to guy for certain things.
And isn't it crazy that, so the facts are, without getting into any creative license, the facts are that newspaper, the Peterborough Transcript, wrote that article. Crazy that they put so much detail in it, saying there were bloodstains on various locations. And the fact is, Russell Henchman went there and cleaned up, what was it, the day after
Yeah.
that article was published.
Or the day of.
The day of that
yeah.
article was published. He goes and cleans up everything. And that really looks like someone read that paper and said to him, you got to get up there and clean all this. What we don't talk about is the fact that the day after the murder, there was one of the worst thunder showers ever in the area. And a lot of people said that pretty much wiped out any evidence of blood or any distress on the lawn of people walking back and forth or any sign of a struggle. So this is after that rainstorm. This is when the paper publishes that article, and then Henchman goes up and under the guise, I guess, of going to make sure that the pipes weren't going to freeze.
Right, which is a ridiculous thing to say because it's August and it was very hot, we know, the day that Dean was murdered. So that is not something that plumbers do in August.
Unless he was a really diligent plumber and was like, you know what, I'm going up there to make sure if no one's going to be around in the winter, then those pipes are not going to freeze on my watch. And I'm going to clean up everything.
I could, even if you just said the pipes, I might as well shut the water off, and just not mention the part about them freezing. That would be a lot less suspicious, for Christ's sake.
You know what? Even if he said, I just wanted to come up here and take a look around and clean up. All you could say at that point is that's a really bad decision, Russell.
Right.
But he has to say this thing about the pipes, and that makes it look like he was just stammering, right? When they asked him, like, what are you doing? I was clean.
It has to be a lie. I mean, it is a lie because it's not going to freeze. The pipes aren't freezing in August, or September or October.
They're probably not freezing. They're
Right.
probably not freezing until like January.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is the series of events that occurred to even put him there in the first place, and the fact that he did clean up after that newspaper article was published.
So it is very suspicious. One question that I have that I don't think we have an answer to right now is, was Russell Henchman a Mason?
That's a great question. And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. All right, here's the next clip.
What's your feeling on the German element that was in Jaffrey at the time and before the murder?
Well, the first point I want to make in response to that is that I think we have to be aware of jurisdiction here. And what I mean by that is that one of the fascinating questions about this is that the responsibility for the murder is a state responsibility. The responsibility for the espionage is a federal responsibility, okay? Now, the federal guys came up here under the auspices of the Espionage Act of 1917, which was passed by Congress in June, and the basic wording of that act was that anybody who's aiding and abetting the enemy is subject to fines, imprisonment, even up to death, okay? And so they got reports from, I think, Mary Ware and Ringe and Mrs. Morrison in Peterborough about these signal lights, and they came up, and they're investigating espionage, all right?
So that Morrison and Ware were the ones that alerted the federal authorities to come up.
Yeah,
in
and that's fascinating too,
Yep.
Lance, because when you read the federal reports, one of the first things you realize is that the federal guys showed up here and they're staying at the tavern in Peterborough. About a week later, they're staying at the Morrison house.
Yeah.
Okay? And she's got a telescope set up in the library and all that. And they're having meals there, and they're having meetings there, and they're helping her with her gardening, and they're shoveling snow, and they're taking her down to the train station so she can get the train. I mean, they're staying at her house. The other fascinating part about this is that the federal guys are here investigating espionage, all right? Mm-hmm. Now, their interest in the Dean murder is tangential in a sense because it's only if that's an act of espionage that they really get involved with us. In other words, if Dean was killed by German spies, then that's where they get involved. One of the aspects of the grand jury was that the Department of Justice, Father Hennon, the selectmen of Jaffrey, all petitioned the judge, Judge Keivel, to allow a federal attorney in on the grand jury to assist in case there was a grand jury on the espionage. They wouldn't have to duplicate the work.
I see.
Right? Adamantly denied that. Okay, Keivel just adamantly denied that, and so you really get the feeling that Keivel really wanted to control who was in the room.
Okay.
Okay, but yeah, you got these two separate jurisdictions, and you got to understand that. The other question I would raise about this is that if there is a collusion between the Masons of Jaffrey, the county guys, and the state guys, they got to know that the federal guys are watching. The federal guys, even though they couldn't get in the courtroom, they hung out in the waiting room. There's this wonderful stories about what went on in the waiting room that the federal guys observed. Okay? Mm-hmm. The overall thing about the signal lights is there was never any arrest made. So, I don't know.
There were definitely lights coming off of the mountains, right? According to Morrison and...
All right, here's another story.
Okay.
In August 1917, Mrs. Morrison was out on the piazza. They used to call them piazzas, the porch. Out on the piazza with a friend after dinner, and she started seeing lights off. I think it was Temple Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
So she got on the phone and called up Robert Bass, who was the former governor of New Hampshire, the Bass family, which is a famous family. All right. She called, and Robert Bass and Mrs. Morrison, I think, were cousins. But anyway, she called up Robert Bass, and he came over to her house with 2 or 3 other men that she didn't know. And they watched these lights, and one guy had a stopwatch, and they were timing the lights. And she took them out up a hill, and so they could see the lights better, and so on and so forth. And that's when they broached the subject of having the government guys come and stay at her house and so forth. And she tells the story in the grand jury that way, and she, of course, makes it sound like she's, on the front lines of defending America against the German espionage. But now you read the Department of Justice reports, and they go interview one of the men that was with Bass that night, and it turns out his name is Benjamin Russell, his name is, and he's an architect, and he lives in Boston. And his version of the story was that, they did see a light, and it was the northern star Sirius, which is the brightest constellation in the northern sky, rising in the sky, and she claimed it was a signal light, and Bass said, no, it's a constellation. And Bass tried to talk her out of it. She would not be dissuaded. She insisted it was a light.
Okay. Now, there are stories that are in the grand jury testimony that they describe it as like fireworks, like
fireworks. There were balloons. There were airplanes. There was Japanese lanterns. There was colored lights. It gets bizarre. I don't know, Lan. I say, well, was there ever any arrest made? And there never was any arrest made. So.
Right. But we know federal agents were in town those days, that day around Dean's murder, investigating the lights, right?
That's correct. Yeah,
okay.
They were here investigating, but they're here for the lights. They're not here for the murder.
That's interesting. Right. Yeah. Okay, so another interesting clip from Jack. This is kind of the first time that we approach the idea that the lights didn't have anything to do with the murder of Mr. Dean.
Yeah, the first time that we say that these are 2 separate incidents.
Mm-hmm.
That the federal agents had been there, I think, up to 2 years before the murder, because there had been accounts of lights coming off of Mount Monadnock, Temple Mountain, Pac Monadnock, that range up there.
Pac Monadnock is a different mountain than Mount Monadnock?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, good to know, because I was confused by that.
Yeah, there's Pac Monadnock, Temple Mountain, Mount Monadnock, and it's all in the Temple, Peterborough, Jaffrey region.
Okay.
The Monadnock region.
Okay. So pretty interesting stuff. I think he makes some good points about jurisdiction and how these 2 incidents really should stay separate, the lights and the murder. Because there was never any arrest made. There was never any conclusion, really, about the lights. However, with that said, still super suspicious about the whole Kofelt thing. So I'm not saying that they're not related, but I think it's really good to look at it like they're not at first, and then you kind of go back to it naturally. Or at least I kind of go back to the idea that Kofelt probably had something to do with the murder, and he may have been shining German lights, or maybe not, or lights for German purposes or whatever. So I don't know. What do you think?
Right. So, like you said, and like Jack said, there was no one arrested for any espionage, shining signal lights. But it was known. It was later known that holes had been bored into the window casings of the big house, and the suspicion was that they were shining lights to, I believe, Pac Monadnock, to relay messages to Mount Monadnock from the big house, and William Dean had amassed a lot of information. I don't know. I mean, we know this because of what he told Mrs. Morrison. Morrison and him would talk about the signal lights at length, and he said when they kicked, abruptly kicked Kofeld off his property and said he's too good of an American to have him on his property. I think it's a little, you do have to keep them separate, but then at some point I feel like they just start coming a little bit closer together, the lights and the murder. Jack gets into the pictures that Der Curler found, and
that's later, but
it is later, but that's one more of that little puzzle piece that brings them a little closer together. It seems far-fetched. All of these things seem far-fetched. Like lights, no, that's just a constellation. But I think it's a little dismissive to say, she's looking at a constellation. This is like, people know what stars look like.
I mean, I've never looked at the sky and said, oh, I think that's signal lights or something like that. Or any kind of weird lights, but also there is the song called "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star." Like, stars do twinkle when you look at them, so they do kind of come in and go out a little bit.
Yeah, or you could be looking at a comet, you could be looking at a shooting star, something like that.
And it was super dark back then. You have to.
There's not a lot of light pollution.
Right, light pollution. We live close to Boston now, and you look up on a night sky, and you don't see the stars like you would have back then. It would have been really bright back then, the stars.
Right, but there are other areas in the country at the time that you could see stars that didn't have FBI agents there. I'm sorry, federal agents there to assess any German signal activity.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to say, oh no, this poor woman didn't realize that she was looking at stars. She was looking at, the brightest star in the northern hemisphere. But I would like to think that she would have known what a star and a signal light would look like.
And if it was just her, that would be one thing. But it wasn't just her. It was Dr. Dean, and it was several other people too.
Exactly.
Okay. And here is the final clip.
What made the Masons so powerful? What was it about them that they could like flex their muscle?
Well, I think we see this. It's kind of interesting because I think we're seeing this today with all the sexual stuff that's going on, and all these powerful men are, being exposed really for bad behavior. I think that the psychology of it is that powerful people want to come together to become more powerful, but the license that the Masons took was that they were a secret. Now, my understanding about this, and I may be wrong about this, but my understanding was that the Masonic allegiance took precedence over every other allegiance. So if you and I are Masons, and you're embezzling money from your work, and I know it, it's a secret. Mm-hmm. Okay? But the social hierarchy was much more structured than it is today. We didn't have the civil rights movement. We didn't have all these civil rights movements. I mean, women and transgender people and all that. It was a hierarchy, a very strict, structured hierarchy, where the English Protestants, Charles Rich, Webster, White, all those guys, they're at the top. French Canadians, Irish, you're at the bottom. Mm-hmm. Okay? This is one of the fascinating things about this, is that Albany Pelletier, who was the night watchman at Bean and Simons, who saw Rich's horse at the sawdust shoot at 9 o'clock, he knew Rich was lying because Rich said he got kicked right before 9 o'clock. It couldn't have happened if the horse was at the sawdust shoot at Bean and Simons, right? Now Albany Pelletier knows that. He's a French Canadian Catholic.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
He's powerless in this society.
Yep.
See?
Yep. So the story is that Dean was with Hodgkins, Georgiana Hodgkins, right?
At that night, yeah.
That night, and they were in town. He met her in town, and
he
then
met her at the drugstore.
Yeah.
They met at the drugstore.
Okay, so take us through what she claims and what happened, and what you said it was Pelletier.
Albany Pelletier.
Yeah, and what his statement is, and how that contradicts.
Well, the contradiction between Rich and Pelletier was that Rich claimed that he was kicked by his horse right before 9 o'clock.
Right.
All right.
And Dean was supposedly came to Rich's home.
Well, that's controversial. Okay. That's controversial.
All right, let's get into that.
Okay, let's get into that. All right.
Okay, so lots of controversy. That's our final clip, and he brings up a whole thing that we don't really have the time to get into in this episode. I mean, that's kind of just how the conversation with Jack goes. You get into another rabbit hole, if you will, and it's just this huge discussion. So this Albany Pelletier situation is very, very interesting, right? So he says that he saw Rich's horse at 9 o'clock.
I was super nervous about this this topic because we're talking about, we keep saying that eyewitness accounts aren't typically reliable. You always have to take them with a grain of salt. And not only are we talking about an eyewitness account, we're talking about one from 100 years ago. And how are we putting a timestamp on that? How are we putting a timestamp on him being absolutely positive that he saw what he saw? I'm
glad you asked.
At 9 o'clock. So, but I was extremely relieved that he had a job that gives him the best, in that time period, gives him the best way to establish, I was here at 9 o'clock. He was the night watchman. He made hourly rounds, and there is a record of him going each hour to each particular location, each at a checkpoint. And he registers that I was here right at this time, and it takes me this long to get there. That was part of his nightly routine, and it's logged.
So he knew within a few minutes when he checked in at 9 o'clock to this one checkpoint, and that's where he saw this horse that had supposedly been at Rich's house giving him a black eye at this point.
Right. He sees the horse and actually walks past it, and they're picking up sawdust, and when the account comes out that Rich had been kicked by his horse, I think Hodgkin's account was that it was just around like 8:45 or right around that time, right around maybe 20 minutes or a half hour before 9 o'clock. Between that time period, that's when he must have been kicked, because if she went back to the house with Dean from the drugstore just around 9-ish, he was already putting hot water, bathing his eye, trying to alleviate the swelling or whatever. And that's when Rich and Dean allegedly had that conversation about applying alcohol, like ingesting alcohol to make it feel better. That was the joke that's in Hodgkin's book. And that's the account that the whole family has. So that doesn't, if he's already bathing his eye at around 9 o'clock, then that means he got kicked by the horse 10-15 minutes beforehand. But how is that possible when the horse was seen at Bean and Simons?
Thank you very much for listening. Please follow us on Twitter at Crawlspace Pod, and we're also on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you very much.